In the mid-14th century, you could go to bed completely healthy and wake up dying. A sudden fever, dark swellings under the arms, and within hours, an entire family could be gone. The death toll rose so fast that church bells rang continuously until cities simply gave up trying to count the deceased. With graveyards completely overflowing, survivors were forced to dig massive trenches, stacking bodies layer upon layer in the dirt just to keep up. To understand the gravity of this collapse, look at the world that preceded it. Thanks to generations of bountiful harvests, the early 1300s saw a massive population explosion. European cities were bursting past their ancient Roman walls, and towering stone cathedrals reflected a society that felt highly capable and optimistic. This map shows a bustling trade network secured by the Mongol Empire. A merchant in Venice could acquire silk from the far end of Asia without ever leaving these protected routes. Spices, gold, and ideas moved across continents with incredible speed. Thousands of miles away from those European cities, in the harsh, windswept steppes of Central Asia, an ancient biological agent had existed for millennia. The bacterium Yersinia pestis lived in a stable ecological balance within populations of burrowing rodents. But in the 1330s, a sudden climate shift, likely a severe drought followed by heavy flooding, devastated the rodents' food supply. Driven by starvation, these infected animals migrated outward, bringing their pathogen-carrying fleas straight toward human trading outposts. The caravans hauling valuable silks and spices westward were now traveling with a lethal stowaway. The exact infrastructure that made the 14th century so wealthy and connected was perfectly optimized to distribute a biological disaster. The infection found its gateway into Europe at a heavily fortified colony on the Crimean Peninsula. This is Kaffa, a wealthy settlement protected by the Republic of Genoa. It operated as the crucial physical hinge connecting the overland Asian silk routes to the maritime networks of the Mediterranean. In 1346, the army of the Golden Horde surrounded Kaffa's stone walls. As the siege dragged into a brutal, months-long stalemate, a silent killer began moving through the densely packed Mongol camps. Soldiers died by the thousands, their bodies turning dark with gangrene as the bacterium tore through their ranks. Facing military collapse, Mongol Khan Jani Beg made a chilling, calculated decision. He ordered his men to catapult the plague-ridden corpses of his soldiers over Kaffa's walls. As infected fluids seeped into the city and fleas abandoned the cold corpses for warm hosts, the unbreakable fortress was breached from within. Panicking Genoese merchants loaded 12 galleys with refugees and cargo. They slipped out of the harbor, fleeing past the dying Mongol army and heading for the safety of home. Deep in the holds of those ships were unseen stowaways. When the fleet docked in Messina, Sicily, port authorities were greeted by rotting corpses on the decks and delirious, bleeding survivors. They ordered the ships to be expelled immediately. It was too late. Black rats carrying the infected fleas had already used the mooring ropes to scurry onto the docks. This map tracks the contagion as it rippled outward across the Mediterranean. It struck major economic hubs like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille in rapid succession. Even pioneering public health measures, like Venice forcing incoming ships to wait 40 days on isolated islands, proved useless against the speed of the transmission. As the disease traveled inland along river barges and Roman roads, it hit the dense heart of Europe. Walled cities like Paris and London featured narrow, sunless alleys and open sewers running down the streets. They were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. The best medical minds of the era, seen here in this 14th century illustration, had no concept of germ theory. Relying on ancient texts, they believed the air itself had been corrupted by miasma or an unlucky alignment of the planets. They ordered people not to bathe, burned aromatic woods, and bled the sick, actions that often spread the infection faster. Every rational attempt to stop the disease failed. The realization that humanity's collective knowledge and defensive strategies were completely useless triggered a profound psychological crisis across the continent. The sheer terror of the physical symptoms, seen in this historical illustration of victims covered in painful buboes, fractured the most basic human bonds. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio documented the collapse of Florence, where fathers abandoned their sons and wives left their husbands behind, walling up the sick in their own homes. With no physical cure, desperate populations turned to radical piety. Bands of men known as flagellants marched from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with iron-tipped scourges. They hoped to absorb the sins of the world onto their own flesh and appease a god they believed was violently punishing them. When prayers went unanswered, the mob searched for a tangible enemy. A conspiracy theory took root, accusing Jewish communities of poisoning the wells. Despite explicit pushback from the Pope, centuries of prejudice boiled over, and entire Jewish communities were rounded up and burned alive in town squares. The devastation wasn't limited to urban centers. Refugee populations carried the disease into the countryside, wiping out thousands of small villages. Harvests rotted in the fields, livestock wandered untended, and the wilderness began creeping back into the carefully managed farming estates. The plague swept across the entire continent, reaching as far as Greenland. It only burned itself out once it literally ran out of easily accessible victims. Modern estimates suggest that up to 200 million people perished, erasing roughly half of Europe's population in under 5 years. This chart illustrates the sudden economic shock that followed. Massive depopulation created a severe labor shortage. For the first time, desperate lords had to offer higher wages and better conditions just to get their fields worked. The rigid chains of serfdom began to crack, sparking a period historians call the Golden Age of the laborer. The survivors carried deep psychological scars. Art from the period became fixated on mortality, specifically the danse macabre, the dance of death. The skeletons in this mural lead a queen exactly as they would a peasant, reflecting a new, cynical understanding that nature treats human hierarchy as totally irrelevant. The institutions that governed medieval life had failed their ultimate test. Yet, in wiping out the stagnant social structures of the time, the destruction cleared a path. A society forced to question its absolute authorities and adapt to a harsher reality began the slow, painful process of rebuilding into the modern world.